Welcome to our private well class webinar for this month, Well Care 101, What You Need to Know to Protect Your Family. Hosted by the State Water Survey at the U of I, or one of the state scientific surveys in Illinois, House State's well logs, all those things. And our program, the private well class, is a cooperative effort between us and the Rural Community Assistance Partnership, and it's funded through US EPA. And so, any questions about any of that, let us know. Okay. Again, this is part of a national program. It's implemented through RCAP to support private well owners. We're the online side of this, and RCAP have staff in every state and are kind of the boots on the ground side. I'll explain a little more of that in a minute. These materials from this webinar, this is not the private well class. These are webinars in support of the class. And I'll talk more about that later. But the private well class itself is a 10-lesson free online class. You sign up, it sends you a PDF once a week for 10 weeks. You're on your own to read it. It's really where you should start if you are interested in learning more about your well and contamination and all the issues related to private wells and groundwater. We will have time at the end for follow-up questions. So if you have any questions during the webinar today, you can put them in the chat or the question box on your GoToWebinar window. And we're going to monitor that. We'll put all those questions together and bring them up at the end. This is a 2-hour webinar, but we're willing to stay as long as needed, as long as you are, to answer any questions we can. So yeah, that's kind of where we're at. If you're attending this webinar and expect to get continuing education credit, we offer that through NEHA and through the Illinois LEHP program. For NEHA, it's a 2-year credentialing cycle. You can't take the same course with the same core content more than once per cycle. And so as an example, if your cycle just started at the beginning of the year, you wouldn't be able to take this same webinar again until after January 1, 2028. And I've listed below in the lower right the past times we've offered this particular webinar. The last one was this last summer. And so you can't get credit for watching. And yeah, you can't get credit more than once during your credentialing cycle, as well as you can't get credit for watching the recording, which we do record these. They go on our YouTube channel. Part of that's, even though we've recorded the other 3 that are listed here, the questions we get asked are different. And so the last 45 minutes or so of the webinar are typically different every time, depending on the questions we get. And so those are actually worth watching, even if you've attended a bunch of these, because there's some interesting questions sometimes that may not have come up more than once that we've tried to answer and provide information about. I mentioned RCAP, the Rural Community Assistance Partnership. So RCAP is a national nonprofit. They're made up of 6 regional partners. These are those listed: RCAC, Great Lakes Community Action, Communities Unlimited. And you can see we're in Illinois, and so we're part of the Great Lakes Community Action Partnership area. And so we work with RCAP staff in the Great Lakes region who do well assessments and put on workshops and help well owners and professionals who work with them, like Extension or health departments or others, to help well owners in their area. Most of their staff are licensed water or wastewater operators, and a lot of the work that RCAP does, they have about 350 staff nationwide, are with small communities, water and wastewater, or with septic, as well as private wells. And I'll show the assessment tool that we developed to help them in the field. It's available to anyone, but if you have a problem well, or you have a well owner that you work with as a professional, and there are some unique issues, or maybe you don't have the bandwidth to actually go out and evaluate those things, you might be able to lean on RCAP to have someone from their staff go out and meet with a well owner, do an assessment, and provide more information that would be beneficial to them and help them understand what's going on. This is one page out of our assessment tool. It's a fillable PDF. We ask a lot of questions. This is sections 10, 11, and 12. There's now a companion on-site wastewater tool. And so this section 10 isn't as important for this. It's all the drinking water side, but this is really just to show you what's here. It asks a lot of different questions about what's going on around the well, how the well construction. They look up to see if there's a log available, and they actually even collect a water sample. That's all free of charge. So it's a really good service. There's a limited number that each region can do in a year, but if you get on their list and you're interested, this information is really valuable to you as a well owner. And they've done a lot of these, but what it really is, for any of you who are county or local health department folks who know what a sanitary survey is, it's really like a sanitary survey for a private well. And for those who don't, a sanitary survey is a vulnerability assessment for a community water supply. And by law, through the Safe Drinking Water Act, small water utilities or all water utilities have to have a sanitary survey, or it might be called a vulnerability assessment, done every 3 years to identify if there are any deficiencies in their system, to ensure that they're providing safe water to the folks in their communities. The Safe Drinking Water Act only covers community and non-community public water supplies. It doesn't cover private wells. And so private well owners were really on our own to take care of all those things and understand the responsibilities and the issues that might affect a well and water quality. So these assessments really give you a chance to not only look at what might be going on for that particular well and well owner and home, but it's also a chance to then educate those homeowners about their specific situation. What I could tell you from my experience is that no two homes with a private well are identical. Even if the well is very similar to its neighbors, there's always something different. The type of pipe, if they've ever treated, what they're doing near the well, storing chemicals, if they use their well water for, mixing chemicals if they're on a farm, all those sorts of things tend up making everyone unique. And so you see a lot of different things when you're in the field, that's for sure. It also gives you a chance to talk about best practices, why they should sample every year, why they shouldn't have their dog tied up to their wellhead, why a Folgers can isn't a great idea as your well cap. All those things are real. They happen more than you would believe. And so, and then lastly, to encourage communication. We have a lot of well owners tell us they don't want to call their county health department or their local health district because they're afraid they'll tell them they can't use their well. There may be a few isolated jurisdictions out east, like in like in the Connecticut, Massachusetts area, where a specific health district may have those rules, but over 99% of the country, that's not the case. Like in Illinois, our health departments, county health departments, might recommend you don't drink your water that has arsenic that's 15 times the level that's allowed by law in a public water supply, but they can't tell you not to drink it or not to use it. And so understanding those things is important. Calling your local health district to find out what the rules are in your area are important. And really it's also about trying to convince well owners they need to be a little bit of an investigator and learn more about the situation that they live under there. So they've done about 3,800 of these. Some are requested by a state or local health agency to support a problem well where, it's a confounding problem. They don't have the bandwidth to go out and investigate every one of those. And so they'll lean on RCAP in one of the regions to go out and do some investigation for them. Again, though, the well assessment is for the well owner, not for the county or state health department. And that stuff isn't shared without permission. And most of the time, these don't get shared with anyone but the well owner. So the RCAP folks also have become well experts in their jurisdictions, if you will. And so they're great to partner with for putting on a workshop for well owners in your local area, bringing in speakers, helping advertise your workshop. They'll do all that. They work with Extension. They work with health departments, they work with drillers, all that. So yeah, it's a pretty good system. And the best part is it's all free because it's funded by the US EPA to help well owners learn more and to be better stewards, which in turn protects our water supplies that are used not only by private wells, but also a lot of community water supplies. I can't remember the number. It's like 95% of all the public water supplies in the country, if you do go by number of supplies, are groundwater and using wells. That's not by population, that's by number of facilities. So we're at the State Water Survey I mentioned earlier. Most folks have never heard of us, a lot even in our state. We're one of the state scientific surveys, a sister agency, if you will, to our State Geological Survey and Natural History Survey and Archaeological Survey. We have a long history. We were started in 1895 because of cholera and typhoid outbreaks. And as the world was learning that those were waterborne, the Water Survey was formed by our state legislature to do that. Today, we're a group of probably a little over 100 staff who provide services. We house the state's well logs. We work with our communities to help them with their water quality and quantity issues. And we do a lot of applied research, which is what I'm mostly involved in, as well as outreach like this program, the private well class. So it's great because we not only get to do research, if you will, but we're not only doing research, we're also going out and investigating problems. Matter of fact, 3 of us are going to a well tomorrow to collect water samples for a very unique problem that's come up, and we hope to make heads or tails of what's going on. So it's more boots on the ground type of thing, and we also collect a lot of data. We have wells all over the state where we collect quantity and quality information, and so it gives us really a leg up in understanding a lot of the issues that private well owners face, not only in Illinois, but around the country. Just a couple examples from our records. I'm really into this. It's kind of the one of the more longer term serving employees here. I've taken up the banner of going through all our archives. This is from Quincy, Illinois, when they first started doing any kind of treatment on their water supply. And you can see these are typhoid outbreaks by year, starting in 1873 to 1910. And when they started using filtering their water, we saw a decrease in use. They also investigated outbreaks of typhoid. This is Rockford, Illinois, is a town of about 400,000 people in northern Illinois. They had a typhoid outbreak in 1913. And one of the issues at the time was most people got their milk from either a service who delivered it, but it was all stored in one large container or vat. And so if that got contaminated, a lot of people got sick. And in this case, I believe there are close to 130 cases. And one of the things they investigated is if it was this one dairy route, if it was the milk for this one E. Erickson, that was causing some of the typhoid problems. And so this is just a graph that someone made on the date of the case, what number it was in the string of 130. Pretty interesting stuff. And this was an old glass plate slide, which is shown up on the middle of the screen there, and it's broken. It's been in our records since probably the 10s, and it's over the years somehow somebody didn't do their due diligence, and the actual glass plate was broken. Still works, still actually looks cooler, I think, because of that. Other things, these were common in Illinois in our public parks. You can see the little tin cup there on the back side of the platform. You didn't think anything of just pumping that a few times, rinsing out the cup, and getting a drink of water. Today, these were outlawed in the late 20s, I think, as far as providing water like that. And but these old hand pumps, water sits in the column because they have check valves, full of bacteria and biofilms, literally always contaminated. Just an old drill rig, again, from our files. Drill rigs today certainly look a lot different. I think I'm going to show one, a modern rig, but it was a lot of work in those days to put a well in, let alone a very deep well. So I'm Steve Wilson. I'm a groundwater hydrologist at the Water Survey. With me today is Katie Buckley, who's our Water Resources Outreach Specialist. She does a lot for this program as far as she fields a lot of the questions that you're going to ask today. She does a lot of the logistics to get these webinars ready, and she also does a lot of the CE work, continuing education support, when you all requested continuing education credit when you signed up for this webinar. And Sally Dolan is a senior scientific specialist in environmental health. She's an EHP. Here at the survey, she's assisted with some of the questions. And Sarah Mandebach is a senior scientific specialist. She helped answer some of the questions you all asked in advance that we have in the slide deck today. Sally and Sarah both also work on our help center, which I'll talk a lot about today, hopefully. That's a great resource. So the things to remember if you're a private well owner is that they're not regulated. I already mentioned that, but they're not regulated like a public water supply is. There's nothing that says you can drink water of whatever quality you want, but it's really up to you as the owner or the user to make sure your water's safe and your system's maintained. So, and the thing you can't go by is taste. I don't know how many people have said, well, you know, my grandparents had this well and it always tasted so good. That means nothing as far as if it's contaminated or not. Arsenic is a very common contaminant in our Illinois groundwater. It's colorless, odorless, and tasteless. You don't know it's there unless you test for it. And that's just one example. I grew up on an old dug well that literally was always contaminated. On a small farm. My grandpa had dug it in 1933, but that's what we knew at the time, and my dad swore our well water was better than city water because cities put chemicals in their water, and that can't be good for you. Not understanding that chlorine's there to kill all the bacteria that can make you sick. So today I live in town. I'm on a public water supply. I say I pay $80 to $100 a month. I keep updating this number because my daughter keeps getting older. She's 14 now. And so it's almost a nightly mission of mine to yell at her to get out of the shower. But, and so our water bill's higher than most, but that cost is spread out over the 150,000 residents. That provides the sampling to make sure the water's safe, all the maintenance, all the treatment, all the infrastructure. So when I turn on my tap, I have water pressure and I have safe water to drink. As a well owner, all of those things are your responsibility. So, and what we find, or what I find, is over my time working with private well owners, which I've been here over 30 years, is that really the biggest reason for well problems and well water quality problems are poor well construction and a lack of well owner knowledge on how to take care of and maintain their well. You know, I mentioned that Folgers can. That's lack of knowledge issue, and it's like I said, it's a real thing. And as far as poor well construction, almost every state's well construction code, when it changes to create a better code, because they've learned something or the science has shown something like grouting a well or whatever it might be, all the wells that are already in place are grandfathered in. And so you don't have to try to make your well meet the new code, which would be a nightmare in all honesty. But as a well owner, you need to understand when your well was drilled, what the code might have been then, and if it still meets muster to what the code is today, or at least understand if it's deficient, why, and if that's a real risk or not. You know, some things like maybe the code was changed from 12 inches to 18 inches of stick up on the ground to help prevent, low level flooding when there's a big rainstorm. That may not be a big deal. Your well may be in a spot that there's never 12 inches of water, but there's other things that certainly matter. And so it's your job to understand that. So as far as well considerations, how deep your well is and the source of your water matter. The location on the landscape matters. Are you down in the floodplain? A lot of times there's no water up on the bluff, and so people put their well down in the floodplain along a small stream because there's sand and gravel there and they can get their water. Well, how often does that flood, or does the well get overtopped? All those things matter. Understanding the groundwater flow direction, that's more of a tough nut to crack, if you will. Typically, that information, unless it's the water table, the shallowest saturated geologic unit, which may or may not be an aquifer, that usually follows the landscape, but groundwater can flow in any direction in a deeper aquifer. It may, the ground may slope to the west. The aquifer that's 150 feet below land surface is actually flowing east. There's no way to know without data. And so, but knowing that certainly helps, and especially if you have a shallow well or a dug or bored well, knowing that if you're in a rural subdivision and there are 7 homes that are further up gradient from you on the landscape that all have septic systems, then your shallow well may be more at risk than that guy who's up on the very top of the hill, because water is going to flow when it gets, the whole point of a septic system is it's slowly treating the water as it percolates through the soil, so that by the time it gets to the groundwater aquifer, it's it's treated, if you will. But that may not always be the case. There may be preferential flow, or there may be cases where there's just way too many homes and septic systems in a smaller area. And so all those things matter. That's why you need to, it doesn't matter necessarily how deep your well is in some cases. And I'll explain that in a minute, I think. And also what you're doing around your well. Are you surrounded by, gas stations? Then again, how deep your well is, how it was constructed, the type of well, and the type of geology all matter as far as what risks you may have. Poor construction, I mentioned a lot of wells are poorly constructed. That's because well construction code keeps changing as we learn more and more. So all the existing wells are grandfathered in, like I mentioned. In the northern climate where you have frost and freezing, you have a frost line in the winter in your soil. Wells used to be put in pits. So you dig a pit that's 4 or 5 feet deep. You have the top of your well down in that pit so that in the winter, that's not going to freeze and your water lines aren't going to freeze. Well, we still see those pits today, and we also see a lot of hand dug wells like the one I grew up on. It's still in use today. They're not safe, and they're generally always contaminated. And the folks who've lived there for 30 years may not get sick from that water anymore because their body's used to it. But if anybody else drinks their water, they more than likely will. And so these poor constructed wells not only are a safety and a public health hazard, but they're also an opportunity for surface contamination. Those pits can fill with water during a rainstorm, and they're a safety hazard. People fall in, animals fall in, tractors drive over them and fall in, all kinds of things. So as a couple examples, the picture on the upper left is from the Washington State Department of Ecology. That is the state agency in Washington State that regulates well drillers and well construction. So that piece of plywood, that yellowish colored or tan colored plywood, used to go all the way across that well top, and a woman stepped on it, it broke, she fell in and it killed her. There's a suction pump there or next to the well, but you can see even the little well house there's a funnel that was probably for oil just laying next to the well. There's all that gray stuff that's likely from insulation that's just laying there and gets kicked into the well. We have many, many horror stories of folks who are like, yeah, I went out to my dad's, he lives on a farm, his water tasted funny, we went out and opened the lid, it's an old dug well, and we could see like 40 snakes down in the well moving around. True story. So understanding those things really matter. Picture on the upper right is Don Kelderman was investigating his family history down in Southern Illinois when I happened to be down there for a different meeting. We stayed at the same place. He had all these cool pictures he'd taken that day, and I just noticed, and we got to talking. This is a dead goat in a well. It's an old brick-lined well, or stone-lined well, excuse me, that somebody had taken a piece of culvert, which is, like culvert that goes under a road, concrete, circular pipe, and put on the top of it, but it only stuck up about 12 inches above land surface. So this well was not in use anymore, but it had been a farmstead, and a goat from a nearby farm had got loose, had wandered over there, fell in, and that's what he found. That sounds like an isolated story. Again, it's not. Rats, raccoons, snakes, frogs, all kinds of stuff, they all are the same. They're biological animals. When they die and decay, they are full of bacteria. They cause all kinds of problems. And the picture on the bottom is a well that's in use. We see a lot of old dug wells like this where they don't have a proper cap or a well house. This has got 2x10s covering it and 2x8s, then with some pieces of tin and concrete blocks, to keep that, quote, safe. Snakes, rats, all those things can get in there, can get in that well, I guarantee it. And the reason those posts look so worn is because that line you see where it looks like a field and then this looks like grass is actually a pasture, and this is full of cattle. And so the cattle can come up and use the posts for scratching, and they've wore down these posts. as well as they do their business there, and that water just seeps right into the ground, or that material seeps right into the ground with every rainstorm. If it's just not a safe way to have your well. And we also run across old hand dug wells, or hand dug wells, I should say, that are in the middle of a feedlot, not even a pasture with grass, but a feedlot that's got 6 inches of mud. Just not a safe place to have your cattle right next to your well. So what can you do? Try to bring them up a code if you can. Understand what things are most important to protect the water quality. If it's a well in a pit, extend the pipe up to the surface and use a pitless adapter. That's why there are no wells in pits anymore, because now they've developed a system that allows you to pull the pump, as well as have the elbow for the water going into your house down at 3 or 4 feet inside the well. It's called a pitless adapter. We talk about that in our private well class. And you can find that information if you have taken the class, or if you do, which I'm going to promote that 3 or 4 times today because it's really important. And also talk to a well authority, a county, a contractor, well driller. Find out what needs to be done and what the risks are. Most of the time they can tell you those things. Same thing with abandoned wells. It's estimated there are as many abandoned wells not in use as there are wells that are in use in the country. Many of these are old hand dug wells that just had a lid put on them, or not even that, piece of plywood. They're not documented because in most states, and some states they still aren't, there aren't well logs recorded. In Illinois, we started recording logs and requiring a permit in 1968. In New York, that wasn't until 2000. There's one state where if the well's less than 4 inches in diameter, it doesn't have to be reported. And so a lot of the drillers drill 3-inch wells there. All kinds of dysfunctional, disjointed efforts because it's done at the state level, and everyone views all those things just a little bit differently. And so we don't know where most of those wells are, and they are found in very difficult ways sometimes. So like well pits, they're a safety hazard. And so if you have an abandoned well on your property, properly abandon it, seal it. Most states have rules on how do you do that, using bentonite, clay, or cement to ensure that you're not creating a pathway for surface water to get down in an aquifer. But at the same time, it's we're talking to someone about and having done. Protect your source. Some other examples. These two are both the 2 pictures are both from also from the Washington State Department of Ecology. They had a blog, and these pictures are dated. They're from 2013, right after we started the class. But the one on the top, they're trying to get a horse out of an old well. The horse named Katie Sue, trapped in an abandoned well. And you can see all the weeds up around it. Hopefully she was okay. And then the second one is this guy was walking in his backyard in Sheldon, Washington, and fell through the grass and 45 feet into a well. His neighbor heard him. The police department came. Very fortunate. They pulled him up and he walked away. But we actually had a case like that just south of here. Another one of our scientists and I went down. This woman called us and said that she was mowing on a riding mower in her front yard, and the land started giving way, and there's a small hole there. So we went, took a downhole camera, and figured out there's a 22-foot hand dug well there. She's so lucky that her and her riding mower didn't fall in to that. And so, yeah, these things they're a lot more common than anyone realizes, especially in rural areas. And I show these newspaper clippings because they're from the 90s. Illinois used to have a groundwater education coordinator. His name was Harry Hendrickson. He worked with schools, did all kinds of great things until the state, in its infinite wisdom, decided we didn't need a groundwater education coordinator anymore. And I was fortunate enough to get most of his materials. And these are just newspaper clippings he showed, but the third one in particular, for those of you old enough to remember, in Midland, Texas, a young girl, Jessica McClure, fell into a well. It was covered live on CNN. I think it took them a little over a day to get her out. And she sang along the way, and again, it was covered live on TV. Today, she's a mother of 3, and these things happen more than people realize. And back in the early 90s and before that, there were no stories on Instagram or X or Facebook that people could find and spread all over the country. You found it out from your newspaper. So a lot of the times people didn't know that somebody in Buffalo Grove died on their 11th, almost on their 11th birthday, whereas, you know, today that would be big news and be all over. We'd all find out about it quickly. So as far as well care, you know, our advice is that you should use a licensed well driller, a pump installer, or contractor if you're doing any kind of service or repair or installing a new well. Some states allow you to drill your own well or may not have some of those rules. In one case in Pennsylvania, anyone can become a licensed well driller by paying a fee, paying their fee. It doesn't mean that you're qualified to actually drill a well. And so here's the modern well I mentioned, Kickapoo Drilling Companies nearby here. They've contracted work through the UI before to put monitoring wells in for us. This is actually a well. They provide this picture. They're drilling a well at a farmstead. But yeah, it's if you don't know what you're doing or if you don't know what the law is, find out. You know, people want to be there on their own. They're trying to be off the grid, all that stuff. In Illinois, you can install your own well, but it still has to meet Illinois Well Construction Code. That's the rule. And so you can't put in a sand point, for instance, which is basically a shallow well that's driven in the ground with a sledgehammer. You've got to follow the code because we're trying to protect public health, and that's what the rules are. And so you should understand those. Find out who in your state is responsible for those things. Or in some areas, like in the east, northeast especially, a lot of it's home rule states where the local rule is what goes. And so your local health district will have its own rules that may be different than a neighboring health district's rules. And so you need to find out what those things are as far, especially putting in a new well. Most states have a guide and rules, and so you can find those on their website. If you, there's an example of that I think I show in the questions, but you just Google my state well construction code and you'll find if they have any and what they are and what the rules are. They're not, you know, the most fun read, but you know, they provide advice. And the other thing I'll say is if you're going to work with a well contractor, in one of our, I think it's lesson 7 or lesson 8, I can't remember, we talk about all the things you need to ask a well driller if you're going to have someone drill a well for you, to make sure you understand what you're getting. Things like make sure you ask for a well log. You'd be surprised how many people have a well drilled and don't have the log, and you need that information. So it's really just a bunch of best practices. As far as the well site, I use this even though this is from Manitoba. It's a really good diagram. It could be mounded here a little more, and what we usually want people to do is to have the ground mounded around a well a little bit at least, so when it rains hard, water's running away and not pooling around the well, just because it could go down the annulus, which is the area outside of the casing. But you know, it's about keeping it clear. If it has a vent, make sure it's got a screen on it so bugs can't get in. It should be elevated above land surface, again, for the flooding issue and ease of access, and it needs to be accessible. I was doing a project early in my career where we went to measure the water level in somebody's well, and he's like, oh, well, you know, I buried the well and put my garage over top of it, not understanding that his pump's submersible. As soon as his pump fails, he has no well and no way to get to it. And we see wells in basements. You hear stories once in a while of someone who's found a well when they, you know, are doing some remodeling on their house, all those sorts of things. So it's really about understanding that your well should be its own entity. It needs to have nothing around it so that it's accessible, and also you're not storing things that might be a risk as far as water quality wise, things like that. As an example, and we made a new version of this, but it didn't really fit on the slide well, so I'm going to use the old one here. Most states have in their well code required setback distances for things. Like in Minnesota, this is from Minnesota, your septic or holding tank has to be 50 feet from your well. And in some cases, a state may also have additional rules when the geology or the surface geology, the soils, are more vulnerable. So if it's really sandy soil, for instance, or if it's fractured, highly fractured rock or karst, it may be that you have to have that at a different distance, or maybe your septic tank even has to be installed in a different way. It can't be a traditional septic tank. But for all these, there's a reason. And that's because they're potentially a health risk or potentially a risk to the water quality in your well. And so they all have, or they may prevent access. So if I go down to the bottom half of this, 3 feet from a building or overhang, if there needs to be something done with your well and your well has a submersible pump, you can't pull the pump if you can't get, the rig or the support truck over top of the well. It's just that simple. And so all these things are meant to protect the well. And again, sometimes setbacks may be doubled if there are specific types of geology or other reasons that it's more vulnerable. And so you should understand that and know where you're at. Sometimes someone buys a 5-acre plot, wants to put a well on it, or even much smaller, they buy a 1-acre plot, and not understanding or maybe not knowing where their neighbor's septic is or their neighbor's well is, those things need to be identified, and so that you're sure that your system's going in a safe place. As far as septic systems, I'm going to talk a little bit about that here. We do a septic webinar. Sally did that in July, and I recommend you go back to our YouTube channel or on our webpage and find the septic webinar, Septic Systems 101, I think it's called. There'll be a lot more detail than I'm going to provide here. But basically, a traditional septic system is a tank where everything from your shower, toilets, everything else comes into this tank. The solids fall to the bottom where they float, and there's a clear water area, and bacteria, a lot of the bacteria from our bodies break all that sludge down over time. And so then when it starts filling up, the water runs out through the effluent pipe and the outlet to a drain field, where then it flows down, percolates down through gravel, crushed rock, or sand, and eventually into the soil. It gets broken down by soil microbes, and so it's fairly safe, and that will last a long time if everything's taken care of. Your septic system needs to be pumped when the solids get to a certain level, and that varies by size of tank and number of people in the home, all those things. But as far as the to-do list, same thing, maintain the area around your tank and drain field. You should have access through the inspection port and a manhole. Only have grass, don't put any trees. They love septic fields that have perforated pipe. Roots will find that water and they will plug it up. And once that's done, you may not have any option but to try to find a whole nother area to put your drain field. And so again, that does not work. So you should try to reduce the flow to a certain degree, not have like your sump from your basement or a whirlpool or your softener backwash go into your septic. The higher the volume, the less time bacteria have to work on the material in there and break it down. And so it's recommended that you don't put any high volume parts of your home, like those things, on your septic. Normal use shouldn't be a problem. Your septic tank should have been sized for the number of people. If you happen to be in a home where originally there was 2 people and it was a small home and now you've added 3 different additions and now there's 7 of you, then you might want to talk to a septic expert about the size of your tank, and if it's, it may mean that it won't work, or that your drain field could be overloaded, or it might mean that you just have to pump it every year versus every 3 or 4 years or whatever it might be. And it really depends, again, how often you pump your tank based on use and volume. And for anyone who says you don't need to pump your tank, I haven't pumped it in 20 years, I say good luck, because eventually it's going to plug. And when it does, it's going to back up into your home. None of those additives or other things are going to stop that from happening. You still have to pump your tank and take the solids out every so often. You should only put your wastewater into your septic tank So garbage disposals, matter of fact, there's some charts available online on the size of your tank versus the number of people and how often you probably need to pump your tank. If you have a garbage disposal and you're using it actively, you should have that time. So if it's 5 years, you should do it every 2 to 3. All those solids, like from your carrot stems and broccoli and everything else, if you're throwing them down there, eggshells, whatever it might be, they will not break down in a set time like other solids will, and so they will just build up in the bottom of your tank, and you'll have solids quickly. And also no man-made stuff. Obviously, if you put pills, you had someone on amoxicillin or some other penicillin type antibiotic. What's an antibiotic do? It kills bacteria. What's your septic tank full of? Bacteria to break down all the material in your tank. It makes you're just killing it's killing the system, so it's not working like it's supposed to. So there should be nothing man-made going down into your system. Again, you have to inspect your tank or have someone do it for you to measure the solids. And if you've never done it before, just hire somebody to come out and measure the solids. If it needs pumped, have it pumped. Just honestly, just suck it up and have it done. It's a lot cheaper to do that than it would be to have something go wrong and your drain field doesn't work anymore because it's plugged. And then, 2 years later, have someone come out just to measure the solids, and then you'll know. If, I think it's between 50 and 60% fold is when they recommend, or maybe it's earlier than that. Sally's probably better at that than I am. But regardless, whatever they recommend for when you should pump it, if it's at 10% after 2 years, you've got a couple of years. And at least based on the size of your tank and the use you typically have, how often you're going to need to have that done. And then you can plan for it. But it's certainly something that everyone needs to do. There's nothing worse than, and this can happen in the community water supply too, because trees get into a sewer line and can plug that up. And if you've ever had your basement toilet back up into your home, you don't want it to ever happen again. That's all I can tell you. So EPA has a really great site for this. Their septic systems website, it's just epa.gov/septic. They put on every September, they put on Septic Smart Week, which is a big effort by all of the folks in the industry and all the associations that work with public health and, protecting water quality and the environment and those things. It's a big push during Septic Smart Week to inform everyone about some of the septic issues there are in the world and why it's important that you maintain your system and some of those things. So this website has a lot more than just for Septic Smart Week. It's got a lot of information on how they work, the types of systems you might have. In some places you can't put in a traditional septic system. It may be bedrock right at the surface, and you don't have anywhere for your drain field to discharge water and have it go percolate through the soil. Some of those things you may have to create that, or you may have to have a more advanced system that does treatment on the water before it's released, like a centralized wastewater treatment plant would do. We see that a lot in areas like in Upper New York, where there's a lot of cabins on lakes. They're right on bedrock. There is no way to put in a regular system. It has to be an advanced system so that you're not discharging waste that's harmful for the lake or the aquifers and things like that. So, like I said, there's just a ton of information here about how they work, a conventional system versus an advanced one, and what some of the things are removing. Some are removing nitrate or other things. All the different types. Like I said, I'm just going to scroll through this because it's something you need to do on your own and read it. What you need to do to take care of it, a lot of good advice. And then there's information about what it actually does when those things are a problem. And we have another program, and I forgot to put that in the slide deck, but we have a website called decentralizedwastewater.org, which is focused on the on-site industry, which on-site means individual home or small group of homes that are using their own treatment system for wastewater. And so I recommend, there's a lot of information there as well, but and you can email us about that if you want more information. But just like protecting your drinking water, this diagram here that's out in the upper middle of the page, it shows that even though their septic system is on one side of the home and their well's on the other side of the home, it doesn't mean, depending on the groundwater flow direction, that you couldn't have that material making its way towards your well. So the important thing is that your drain field's working properly, that the soil it's going through is actually, quote, cleaning that water to a level that it's not putting bacteria and other things into the aquifer. And so it's just, you need to be aware, and that's why you need to sample as well. So you can see here, it talks about the different pieces, how it might affect your well. And this is just one example. The groundwater flow could be the other way. It could be from, instead of left to right, it could be right to left. And so depending on the amount of soil there is there, how high the water table is, how deep you're getting your water from, we do see sometimes that when people have coliform problems, it's because of their septic, and there's actually a kind of a hydraulic connection between where they're getting their water and their drain field. And that's just the geology that happens to be there. There's nothing that can be done about it. In those cases, we'd recommend putting in continuous disinfection, because there's always going to be bacteria getting in the well. And that's unfortunate, but it happens. There's also a lot of technical resources on advanced systems. Again, I'm not going to go through it, but and some webinars available. Like I said, this site has a ton of information on septic systems and on-site systems and things that you need to know. And as well as our website, decentralizedwastewater.org, we highlight all of the EPA's information, plus all the other information from the key players, like NAURA, the National National On-Site Wastewater Treatment, or National On-Site Wastewater. Help me out here, somebody. It's not Recharge Association. Anyway, it's NAURA, NOWRA. And I think I showed some of that here in a minute. Oh, well, I got ahead of myself. So they worked with RCAP to put together this on-site wastewater treatment system guide. It's a really comprehensive set of material that goes from step A to step Z. It's really made for homeowners. Oh, it's the Wastewater Recycling Association. See if I would have just, Anyway, so if you've not seen this, I recommend you download it. It's also free on NAURA's website. And NAURA is the national association that represents a lot of the state associations that are for wastewater professionals and on the on-site side. So these are the septic installers and pumpers and regulators that ensure these systems are put in properly, that they're following state or county or local code, that they're putting in a system that's appropriate for the soil types and the geology and those things. And so, there's a lot of good information in here on each system. Diagrams explain how they work and why. The picture on the bottom here, the media filter septic system has two tanks, a septic tank and then a pump tank, so they can run it through a treatment system. Just because of the situation for that home, it requires additional treatment. And the water's discharge actually meets, like the NPDES standards, which is the National Pollutant Discharge System that the EPA requires, public facilities to meet. And so you can't discharge things that have levels of any kind of contaminant above whatever the standard is. We are developing a lesson for our class that goes along with all this. Right now we have about a page or a half a page that's about septic systems, and we're developing a separate lesson. So there'll be 11 lessons instead of 10. This will fall in as lesson 6. That's where it fits in the kind of the scheme of things. We're working with NAURA. We'll use a lot of their resources to build that. And it's based on that user's guide I just showed. So as far as testing, what we recommend is you test your well annually for coliform and nitrate, or anytime if you open the well, you're risking allowing bacteria to get in. And so it's just a general best practice that you should test it. Or if you notice anything, there's a change in taste, odor, color, An example might be that you have a PVC cased well. It's out in the middle of the yard. You got a teenager who likes to have, the lawnmower and road gear, if you will, and maybe he hit it and cracked it, and you didn't know about it. There's a lot of reasons why things can happen. And so if something does change, you should just test it to be sure. So, and what do you test for? Well, I'll give you a list of what we recommend. It's kind of a national list. You got to remember here that we have an audience that covers folks from all over the country. There are going to be local things that you need to test for, and I'll show you an example of that. And so you need to ask. But it also depends on depth of your well, where your water's coming from, what's already known about the area. We know, the State Water Survey, we know where there's arsenic in Illinois. We know which aquifers have it and why, and where it's a risk. And so if I'm in that area, I would tell a person, make sure you test for arsenic. In other areas, we know it doesn't, it's very low, we never see it. And if they're on that aquifer, they wouldn't need to test for it. It's a natural occurring element in the Earth's crust, and it's just there or it isn't. And so it really depends on those things. So if there have been any, you should ask your state folks, your county or local health department folks, neighbors, a driller, co-op extension, all those folks may have some idea if there's anything in the area that might be a risk that you should be testing for, as well as identifying what's near you. If you will, like I said, if you live near a gas station, it's expensive, but if you have a shallower well, you might want to test for hydrocarbons, that sort of thing. So then the whole point about sampling annually for coliform nitrate isn't that coliform or nitrate themselves are a health risk per se, but they're fairly ubiquitous in the surface environment. And if you have either one, it means there's likely a pathway from the surface into your well. And that's really what you test annually for. You test for those things, because if you have coliform in your well, coliform itself is not a health risk. It's E. coli. But if you have coliform, it comes from animals, so does E. coli. So if it can get in your well, so can other things. And if there's nitrate in your well above background levels, that may mean that because of surface influence, fertilizing your yard, any of those things can cause all that to happen, or even from your septic, right? Then that means there's likely a pathway into your well, and you need to figure out what that is, and find out if there's a way to stop that from happening, so to speak. So some states also have guides, like this is Massachusetts on their DEP web, their Department of Environmental Protection. You can type in your address. It'll tell you what your probability is of having either arsenic or uranium in the bedrock. So if you have a bedrock well and you're in Massachusetts, you can type in your address, and there's areas where they know it's high in one of those two things or both, and it may give you some guidance on whether you need to test, especially like for uranium, which wouldn't be a normal routine test. Like arsenic's a metal, so when you do metals testing for lead and iron and everything else, you also usually do arsenic as well. And so it's usually easier just to go ahead and test for that. But uranium is a different story. This is Rhode Island, which is 30 miles wide by 40 miles tall or so. Very small area. Many counties are bigger than this in some states, but those little dots are all where there used to be orchards many years ago, back when arsenic was a main component of a lot of pesticides used in orchards to keep things from eating, their fruits and crops. And so those have been identified. Most of them have soil contamination of arsenic, and some have groundwater contamination of arsenic. So they've identified them, and just noting that they're all over, right? So it's probably worth testing for arsenic in Rhode Island. That splotch that's in the middle, that's where there's elevated beryllium. And so this is my poster child example of why you need to ask. I had no idea beryllium was even regulated as a contaminant through the Safe Drinking Water Act, which means it has health effects if you drink water that has elevated beryllium, until I saw this map on their website more than 10 years ago. So I highlight this because this is why you ask. If you're in Rhode Island, I would sample for beryllium. And you can look on the EPA's website under the Safe Drinking Water Act or under the primary drinking water contaminants to find out the health effects of beryllium. But it does have health effects if you drink elevated beryllium. And so you just don't know, right? What might be in your area. And so it's always worth finding out as much information as you can. You know, as a well owner, the theme here is really you need to be inquisitive. You need to use the web if you're familiar with that. If you're not much into using your computer, you need to go ask. Use your telephone. People are one or the other, is what I've learned. Either there aren't many of us that do both, but there's some people who just don't like to be on the phone. They'd much rather find it and not have to talk to anybody. And I get that's a younger generation thing, and that's great. It's because there's a lot of good information out there if you know where you're looking. But also calling someone with who is a groundwater expert or a water quality expert or knows a lot about their aquifers, which would be like a state geological survey or the USGS, or it's different in every state. In Wisconsin and Missouri, it's DNR. In Massachusetts, it was DEP. It just depends on the state what agency is dealing with water quality, but there are folks you can ask. This is probably one of the nicer viewers that's available. Wisconsin DNR, I believe they contracted this through the University of Wisconsin Stevens Point through their extension group. But anyway, this is a viewer that's been developed with a database behind it of all the water quality samples from private wells in every county. And this is just one snapshot, but if you can go to this private well viewer, water quality viewer, and I clicked on a county that was red under arsenic. So the bottom legend shows that for the counties, that's the county level. If it's 21 or higher, then it's a red county. If it's 16 to 20, if it's 11 to 15, it's yellow. So you can see which counties have some elevated arsenic. Now the standard for a public water supply is 10 parts per billion, or micrograms per liter. So if it's averaging over 21, there's a fair amount of arsenic there. But then you can also look at the statistics. They have 1,700 samples for this one county. 590 of those had none detected. The maximum value was 15,000, which is an acute problem. And we already know, or they already know, that there is a certain geologic unit in the bedrock in Wisconsin that has that high arsenic, and they've actually legislatively made it illegal to put a well that taps water from that unit now. You can go below it, but you have to case through it so that you're not getting water from it, I believe, or you stop before you get that deep. But 428 samples were above 10, which is the health standard, which is 25% of the wells that were sampled. That's out of 1,714. But you can see most of the wells, 75% were either non-detected or below 10. There's if I was going to move up by Green Bay, all those counties near there have at least some elevated arsenic. Before I bought a home, I'd test it. There's ways to treat it. It doesn't mean you shouldn't buy a home or that you should be worried about it too much. It just means you might need to add treatment to your system, which a lot of people have. And so, yeah, anyway, it's pretty interesting that they have this kind of data available. And I used arsenic, but you can see on the right, on the left, there's all kinds of things. You can look at iron, copper, lead, manganese, nitrate, all kinds of stuff. And pH is important because it is one measure of, and pH and alkalinity help determine how corrosive water might be. So if you have an older home with lead pipes or copper pipes with lead solder, you could have copper or lead issues in your drinking water if the water is corrosive. So that's really a useful tool. So this is what we recommend annually for coliform and nitrate. And then, if you've not done it before initially, then, every 3 to 5 years, sample for this list of things as a general rule, and then add what you need to add. If you have galvanized pipes, those have zinc, cadmium, and lead. It's a good set of constituents that typically are in groundwater, a lot of them. Like, you can have fluoride naturally occurring in groundwater, iron, lead, manganese, sulfate. And like manganese, it's considered a secondary contaminant federally, but we now know it causes neurological problems. And so a lot of states have set their own limit for their public water supplies, but you need to know if there's manganese in your well. It's common, just like iron is, which iron's not a health risk. It's just a pain because of, the staining it does and those things. But manganese can actually have health effects. And it's like, at least in Illinois groundwater, we see a lot of both iron and manganese in our natural groundwater. So, and then again, get advice from your local or state health department or other state agency that deals with water quality to understand where there might be risks. As far as where to get it analyzed, every state accredits labs so that public water supplies can get their testing done by a certified lab. And many of those labs will also test private wells. You also may have, some states have programs for private well sampling. Iowa has a program where their state legislature gives money to their counties every year, not only for well testing, but for well abandonment and other things that they work with their drillers, and they can cost share some of those things that are, like abandoning a well or a water sample. It may not be free, but it may be half price. That's still a bargain if you can get a water sample collected and only have to pay half of it. So if you go to a lab, they should be able to give you good instructions, tell you what you need to do to store and preserve a sample if you do, and also give you all the information for collecting the sample, the process you go through, how quickly it needs to get back, and then they should be able to answer other questions you have as a well owner. And what I tell people is if they can't do that, you should find another lab. If they can't give you good advice and they don't know much about wells, then you're going to go into somebody else anyway. And maybe that's fine. You use them just to get the analysis done, but you need to know who you can go to help understand the results you get. So as far as finding certified labs, just Google EPA certified labs. You'll find this page, certification of laboratories for drinking water. And then as you go down this page, there's a link. This is a slide that's maybe a little dated, but these are the state agencies that are required to certify labs for the communities in their state. And a lot of those, like for Illinois, they tell you if it's for bacteria testing or other constituents, chemicals and those things, or both. Some labs only do one or the other. And it's got all the information about each one. It's quite a long list these days in most states because of FedEx and UPS and USPS. You can get a sample overnighted from almost anywhere to almost anywhere. And so, I know the Illinois list is 78 pages long, something like that, because there's a lot of labs in other states that have went to the trouble of being certified in Illinois. So, public water supply can send a sample to them just as easily as taking one that's 30 miles away because they just ship it. Just a couple examples. This is New York State Department of Health. This is the website you go to for theirs. It asks you what county information. This is South Dakota's Department of Environment and Natural Resources, EDNR, and they list theirs on the ones that are in their state. And then there's Oregon's. You can search through their system. And it takes you back. There's a national system now. It's a little easier to use through the National Environmental Lab Accreditation Management System. Which is an organization through NELAC Institute is what certifies labs around the country. And then we also recommend TapScore. And, it's a company, it's unique. They're like a middleman, to be honest, but because they have contracts with nearly 200 labs around the country, they do all the other services, so the lab only has to do the testing. They provide all the services beforehand, they send the kits. They also provide support after the fact. They've got a really robust online system that talks about all the different constituents and what they mean. They've provided us with a couple free water tests every year for our Pledge to Test campaign, which every March during Groundwater Awareness Week, we offer, we ask people to pledge to test their water. And for everyone who pledges to test, we'll put you in a lottery to get a free TapScore kit. And it's really a good model. And the main reason we recommend it, even though it's a company, is, I mean, most of the labs are private labs and they're companies as well, but it's also cheaper because of the volume they do. They can offer their water tests at a lower rate than most labs can do. And, you know, for a lot of the folks we deal with, it's the cost of an analysis that's the limiting factor. And so I know their well test just went up to like $200, but one of the labs that's near us, it's over $300 for the same tests. And so, yeah, anyway, that's the logic I use to justify working with them and possibly working with them closer in the next year to provide this to the folks who work with us. As far as interpreting your results, there are a number of websites out there or documents that explain what each result means and what's the health limit. Again, that's based on the Safe Drinking Water Act for community water supply. In general, most private well folks who deal with public health use the Safe Drinking Water Act values as a guide for private wells, even though it's not enforceable in any way. So like for arsenic, I tell people, you know, public water supply in Illinois has to have their arsenic level below 10 to serve it to their customers. And so, you know, the EPA and the state consider that safe. So that's what we would recommend you do. You know, some people may feel like it needs to be lower. You know, California lowered their arsenic value that's required in their state. I think it's to 5, it might be 3. And there's a couple of the states that followed suit with that. And so it's really, those are guides, like I said, because they're not enforceable, but that's what we would recommend. And it's a standard that everybody, you know, meets, if you will. There are other things out there that are health goals or sometimes by an environmental group that may be, you know, impossible to do. For one, it's impossible to treat your water to that level without spending thousands of dollars. And so, yeah, anyway. There's a tool called the Be Well Informed Guide that was developed by the New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services. We had them speak at our 2017 private well conference after they developed this because it's really cool. It's a website. You can go down to the green bar at the bottom and click enter your water test results. You type in your results, you tell it what units, which is the big thing, because a lot of times people get confused on understanding the differences in those units. And if your lab lab results happen to be not all in milligram per liter, which is the standard, if you will, but if it's a micrograms per liter, 15 micrograms per liter is 0.015 milligrams per liter, and the standard is 0.01. So it's 10 micrograms per liter, right? I mentioned earlier, which is ppb, same thing. And so instead of having to try to do that calculation in your head, dividing or multiplying by 1,000, you can put in the units that are right on the piece of paper that you got or the PDF you got from your lab. This is New Hampshire's website, but you can put in what town or city is anonymous. So anyone can use it, which is really cool. And there's also now, after 2017, and the EPA got this code from New Hampshire, this was all funded through CDC. So the CDC ultimately helped provide this. And now there's like 10 or 12 states through the Environmental Council of the States. You can go to their website there, and we have a link to that, I think, on our webpage. And you can get to your state's version of this. And the difference is, you'll see at the end, they put in state resources, trying to help the folks in their state understand their groundwater quality. And most states have their own materials that they would prefer their state citizens use. And so that's where this comes into play. But for this, why it's so cool, one is it tells you if it's over a limit. As I mentioned, 15 micrograms per liter is 0.015 milligrams per liter, and the standard is 0.01, which is 10. And so it's over the value. It's considered a drinking water standard. And then it tells you what kind of treatment would work on that. And that's important because you need to understand that a point of use arsenic absorptive media or an RO unit are the only things that really work well there. And so you have some information you can go search up then and figure out what you might want to do depending on what level you have. And it's the same for any constituent. They talk about the point of treatment. more information, again, there's also materials. I only entered the arsenic value, but you can see at the bottom it doesn't like that I didn't put in any other values for the other constituents. And the message here is, if you're going to do any kind of treatment, make sure you're using a certified treatment device. It's either ANSI NSF Standard 53 for absorptive media, or NSF ANSI Standard 58 for RO, reverse osmosis. And if it doesn't have a seal that says that it's been certified by a third-party certifier, then you don't know for sure you're getting something that's going to work. And our lesson 10 of our class, when you get to that, talks all about the certifiers. There's 3 really main ones: UL, Underwriters Lab; NSF, the National Sanitation Foundation; and WQA, the Water Quality Association, and their Gold Seal, that do third-party certification. And it needs to have one of those emblems on it if you're going to buy treatment, or you don't know for sure what you're getting. It doesn't necessarily remove what it says it will. These are all tested against challenge waters, they're called, that make sure that they're removing the constituent that they say they can. Again, these are tools. The Be Well Informed tool is great. Real big proponent of it because it allows you to change units, and it also provides guidance on treatment. But you should still take your sample results, especially if there's anything that looks like it might be a health risk, to a qualified person, and either public health person at your county health department or local health district, or even maybe state toxicologist or state epidemiologist, or your doctor. And sometimes those folks may not be able to give you an answer, especially a doctor. They haven't necessarily been trained on what do I do if I have high arsenic, per se, but you should ask and find out what's going on with that. And yeah, everyone's job is to try to make sure your water's safe to drink. Like I said, in most cases, they can't tell you to stop drinking your water or condemn your well, but they can only recommend it. And I say that most now. I used to say no one could, and then I went to an event in Connecticut with a group of public health district professionals who are involved with their groundwater well protection programs. And one of those folks told me that they've written their own rules so that they can condemn a well. And that's the first time I'd heard of a local level being able to do that. And that's been 8 or 10 years ago. So what I tell people to do is ask, call your local health district or your county health department and ask what legal authority they have. And then you can decide how you want to go forward with that. As far as treatment, there's really treatments for 2 reasons. It's either health effects, which under the Safe Drinking Water Act would be primary drinking water contaminants, or cosmetic issues or aesthetic issues, and that would be secondary treatment, which is staining, color, odor, taste. Yeah, and so if you don't like the taste of your water, you may put on a carbon filter or something on your kitchen sink. But if you have other things like arsenic, you might put an RO unit on. It just depends. Don't assume, test. And the reason that's there is because some people have the wherewithal or have the money to just put on treatment. And some will do that without ever testing their water. I went to a home to do a well assessment in a fairly wealthy area, and they had like $7,000 worth of water treatment equipment in their basement. And I just said, "What's in your water that you need all this equipment?" He goes, "What do you mean?" He goes, "We never tested our water. We just want to make sure it's safe." There's really no reason to do that. If you don't test, there's a lot of well owners who do no treatment whatsoever and their water is fine. It really depends on the groundwater and all the factors that affect surface water influence, what's naturally occurring in the geology. You need to test. That's the bottom line. So before you add treatment. And again, sometimes you're doing it for taste. I have a colleague here who they put on a unit on their kitchen sink because they didn't like the taste of their well water, and they like it much better with this device. And it just turns out that device also removes like 30 other things, including lead. So they're protecting themselves much more than they realized, but they didn't do it for that reason. So, and again, know what it does do and doesn't do. Find out if it's certified for certain things and what those are. If someone tries to, if someone comes and does a litmus test to tell you your water's a little bit corrosive or the pH is below 7, that doesn't mean you need a bunch of treatment necessarily at all. And there's a lot of areas in the country where the natural groundwater is below 7 pH. A lot of Illinois, it's above 7.5. Neither of those things mean that's safe or unsafe. So just know what you're getting into. And the last thing is, rarely, if ever, will you need a whole house purification system. Now, I say that meaning for like an identified contaminant that may be a health risk, like arsenic. Some things are meant to be whole house. And so common examples of that would be an iron filter, because you have so much iron, it's staining all your porcelain. It may even be forming scale on the inside of your pipes. And so you need to remove the iron when it's coming into the house so that you're preventing all that from happening. Or a water softener. You have hard water, you're using soft water, you want to have soft water in your home. So you're using a whole house water softener. That's typical. But other treatment, again, like RO, you can get an under the sink, which is called POU, point of use, or you can get one when it comes into your home, which is point of entry, POE, and unless it's a very unusual condition where the arsenic level was through the roof. You don't need a whole house RO. And RO is both expensive, especially a whole house RO, and it also wastes a lot of water. I think it's 1 gallon of water treated, it takes 5 gallons of water coming into the unit. The rest is all waste. And so what we typically find in groundwater does not cause problems other than from drinking it. So there's no reason to put in a whole house system, even into the hundreds. It's fine. It's not a dermal risk, it's not an inhalation risk, it's only a drinking water risk. So understand those things. And again, if it turns out to be something that could cause problems with inhalation or dermal through your skin or breathing it when you're like showering, then that would be when you'd recommend that. But I would make sure you're informed before making those decisions. And the other thing is maintenance. I know we have a question today about that, how often to change my filter. The bottom line is you should change your filter at least. You should do any kind of maintenance, whether it's changing the filter, replacing a bulb, whatever it might be, like for an ultraviolet light system. You should do that at least on the maintenance schedule recommended by the manufacturer. And I know a lot of times people think, well, the manufacturer wants to sell me more, so they're going to tell me to do it more often. Follow those directions, because if your filter, for instance, has bacteria growing on it, which it's not maybe meant to, you didn't buy it to remove bacteria, but you have bacteria because you're in a natural groundwater system, those things can become a source of your contamination. They could cause coliform problems and other things, or start growth on those filters. So you need to be strict about that. And as I'll talk about in the question we got today, sometimes you may have to do that more frequently than that even. But you should follow the recommendations, period, and make sure your device is working properly. It might either causing contamination or costing you more money in the long run. So about the private well class, this webinar is not our class. And I say that every month. When we first started these, very few people even knew what our class was. They were on our webinar and had no idea we had a class that was separate. These webinars are meant to support the private well class, which is a 10-lesson self-paced class you sign up for online, and it emails you a lesson once a week for 10 weeks as a PDF. You're on your own to read it. The webinars are meant to support that. Some of the figures you've seen and we'll see here in the questions in a minute are from the class. And so it's really, these webinars are as much about giving folks who have taken the class a chance to ask other questions, or questions that they didn't understand from the class, as they are anything else. So yeah, I recommend, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. We also provide support. It says email and a dedicated phone line. We have a help center now that you can call us. We have people who are there to answer the phone. You can look on our website. We've taken some of the most common things and we provide those as basically articles that you can read, all kinds of valuable stuff. This is our front page. If you go to privatewellclass.org, You can see there's a button there that says visit the help center, and a little further down it says ready to learn more, take our private well class. So if you follow that down, you come to a page where you click on enroll in class. You click on enroll in class below that, and it takes you to this page to sign up. Just ask your first and last name, your email address, and your location is what state you're in. And that's really just so we can count beans and show the people that fund us and support us that we're working with folks all over the country. And if you're a well user, that's the button you check down at the bottom. But if you're a private well professional or a decentralized septic user or professional, we have some other resources that might be valuable to you too, as well. Like I mentioned earlier, for decentralized wastewater professionals, we have an entire website that's just dedicated to that industry. It's called decentralizedwastewater.org, and I recommend you check it out. There's a version of our class that's in Spanish. Very fortunate to have access to some very smart people at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. You know, there's 40-some thousand students, world-class research university. We had a young man who was here from Columbia on a Fulbright scholarship from his country, and he translated the entire thing for us. And you know, turned out because he was on a Fulbright, he was a PhD student and didn't have teaching responsibilities, and he had the time and was interested. Was actually frustrated by some of the translations that are done by some of the by automatic translators and stuff. And he not only did the lessons, but he also did the figures. And so that's available. Just ask us if you work in an area with a lot of native Spanish speakers. It's a good resource. For each of our 10 lessons, there is a set of other materials. Right here, the science of groundwater is lesson 1. And so these materials that we found, I'll shout out to Lyle Raymond. These are in the 80s, but they're really good explaining groundwater and aquifers. And we use several of his figures from the Water Resources Institute and Cornell Extension in our lessons. But there's a list of these materials for each one. They're, you know, the private well class is written as if you're talking to someone. It's meant to be that way anyway. And so these are written in different styles, different sets of facts at different, you know, knowledge levels. It's a good way to gather more information and learn about things. We also do webinars. You're all here for that today. What I'll say is we record every webinar, and we do a webinar every month. Some are for well owners, some are for environmental health professionals, some are for real estate agents and real estate professionals. You can look through the list. If you click on free webinars, you can see what's coming up, you can see what's been done. And then we also have some webinars that are either one-off or we've only done 1 or 2 times. And so those are, if you scroll down the webinars page, you'll get to learn on your own time. It's like there's one on well water chemistry we did with our lab here, and there's one on water testing and treatment. And you can watch that on YouTube, and you can go through that list and see, you know, there's a lot of different ones. Conducting assessments. The third from the bottom, private domestic wells determining the density of census block and understanding potential sources of contamination. The US EPA did this really large study a number of years ago where they estimated the population of people on wells based on using census information and community data from the community survey and what that means, as well as information on like underground storage tanks. And so we asked them to do a webinar for us to explain all those materials that are available online. So there's just a lot of, like I said, one-off things. We did a webinar with labs, so near at the bottom, really about what labs need to know, and it was focused on supporting and giving information to folks who work at a lab. They're all on, again, on our YouTube channel. It's just Private Well Class under YouTube. And you know, this summer in May, we had the one with the picture down there near the bottom is Jennifer and Jackie are both PFAS experts, and this webinar was entitled What Private Well Owners and Well Professionals Need to Know About PFAS. It's really useful information. Jackie was in charge of a research project where they sampled all over the country and looking at specific scenarios. And there's, like I said, there's a lot there that's beneficial to a homeowner. Yeah, when you get to these recordings, I'm not sure why I put this one up, just to say, you know, we do these fairly regularly. Again, the webinar we're doing today, the last time we delivered it was in June of 25. And so, yeah, just to be aware again, like we did this one in August, and I think we did it last month, maybe. But the questions at the end that we're going to get to in a minute will be different. And so these are all the times we've delivered that particular webinar. That's why I showed that, I guess, because it's something that, you know, we have new people signing up for the private well class all the time who find out about us and our well owners. And so these never get old. As far as the information we need to provide the well owners is very similar as it was 10 years ago. But the advantage here for you all is that you can go to any one of these and just scroll forward till we get to the questions, which we're about to get to. And some of the questions will definitely be different than they are today. Most of them, I would say. There's some that we get asked every month, and I try to answer those at least every other time or so, just because they're common things that are an issue for people. But you can find all of those on these videos. And again, it's all recorded. So everything we say today will be available after today on a YouTube video as well. We also have on our YouTube channel these little short training videos. A lot of them are a few minutes long. What's an aquifer? What's an artesian well? You know, what's a Duggar bored well? They're all just a small shot, one time, one topic. Thing. It's, you know, meant to be short. One of these videos is, how does my pressure tank work? I think it's the most popular one. It's had almost 500,000 views. And that tells us that there's not a lot of information about septic tanks, pressure tanks out there, and a lot of people have problems with their water well pressure, which, you know, if you don't have your tank set properly, then your second story may have very low water pressure, and you know, there's things that can be done about that. We started a podcast about 4 years ago. It's called Tap Talk, the Drinking Water in Rural America podcast. It's just drinkingwaterpodcast.org. We interview professionals. There's Jackie, who just talked to us about PFAS on our webinar in May, talking about other topics, environmental justice. They'd worked in an area where there's a lot of challenging issues in some parts of the country. Where folks don't have the support or the funding they need to take care of their wells or understand the issues that might be there. Brian Swistock's retired now from Penn State Extension, but I just said this to someone the other day. He's probably the most knowledgeable well expert I've ever met, and that's no doubt. He is the guy. And so we interviewed him about the work they do at Penn State Extension at the time, and that was in September of 21 on helping the well owners in Pennsylvania. So, and Dr. Wolf is the head of pediatrics at Boston Children's Hospital at Harvard Medical School. He deals with really odd, severe, off-the-wall types of problems with children's health, and some of those end up being related to their private well. And so really an interesting topic. And Eric Yegges with the Water Quality Association is a treatment expert. So what I didn't mention yet is this podcast is really for all of rural America, if you will. It's not just private well folks. It's also small utility and folks who work with community water supplies or non-community systems, or on the fringe of that somewhere. And so there's some really interesting podcasts there. Going back to our front page, which is on the bottom here, the Help Center. So almost 2 years ago now, we developed a Help Center online. We were encouraged to do this to provide resources for well owners more than just having an email and a phone number. So we've created a knowledge base that answers like 150 or so of the most common questions. And it's got its own internal AI that uses our answers and our resources to come up, honestly, with a better answer if you talk to the chat bot. Sally Dolan has been running that program and put a lot of the material together. And Sarah Manderbach, who is really just starting on our program, is the other person involved, in someone you may get an email response from, or may answer the phone when you call. But if you click on Help Center, it takes you to this page. It's you can call us, you can email us, or you can ask the chatbot. If you type in something like flood, that was one of the questions we had, 2 questions today, I think. It gives you all the different articles that deal with that. And so, is my well safe after a flood? So if I click on that, it brings me to this article. You can get disinfection instructions. It walks through, and this actually is the text from one of those short videos I mentioned, is my well safe after a flood. But it walks you through. You can scroll down the page, and it's all the text from that, and what you can do. At the very bottom, we list additional resources and also related articles. And at the very bottom, just to answer your question, if you say no, it's going to ask you why and what were you really trying to find out. And so then we can try to tailor this a little better, or maybe email you back a response that, if it's some specific thing. What I can honestly say is, for every time someone used to ask us, what do I test for? Now we don't get those calls, at least anymore. People go to our knowledge base on our Help Center, and we provide all that information like I did today on the webinar. What we get are questions that are much more detailed and individual. The one that comes to mind always is, I just put in a new drop pipe for my well pump. It's galvanized pipe. How long does it have to season before it stops releasing cadmium into my water? Well, it's testing high for cadmium because he has a new galvanized pipe that's in water. That isn't a simple answer. I had to do a fair amount of research and talk to a number of other professionals in order to come up with a response to that. And so that's the challenge we're finding, is that we've had, I don't know, over 20,000 people read some of these articles now in less than 2 years. But the questions we do get usually require time and effort to answer. And that's okay. That's what we're here for. But yeah, it's pretty interesting how that's evolved. So really, the goal of our overall program is to understand just about helping well owners become more aware. You need to know you need to understand your well log if you have one, and find it if you don't. And it may not be available, and that's just the way it is. But maybe there's a neighbor's well, or all the wells in the area where there are logs are all the same depth, all in the same aquifer. It's very likely yours is too. But you understand how deep your well is, where your pump's set, if it has a screen, how much casing there is. Bedrock, the 200-foot bedrock wells could be very different if one only has 20 feet of casing and the other one has 180 feet of casing. Because in a bedrock well, it has to be open hole. You're only drilling so far and putting a casing in. The rest of it, the actual bedrock hole that you drilled through, is the casing, and that's so the fractures in the rock can provide water. But if you have 20 feet of casing in that 200-foot well, that means 180 feet of it is open to water coming in, and water can come in as close as 20 feet from the surface. That's much different than a well that has 180 feet of casing before any water can get in it. That means water is going to be much further from the surface, much more likely to not have surface contamination. Well, doesn't necessarily mean it won't, but all those things matter. Finding out if there's naturally occurring contaminants or any water quality issues, what are the sources nearby, who can you ask those questions? That's all the things that you'll learn. It also, what we found is going through the class itself really helps you ask better questions. And I'll give you a couple examples of that later. And where your sources of local information are. And lastly, that you need to sample your well. That's the one thing. If you don't have the resources to do anything else, you should try to sample your well regularly and understand what the water quality is. And I guess the goal of our program is really these things: helping well owners understand why their well is important, why they need to understand how it works, and what they can do to protect themselves from risk from their water quality issues. So we got a bunch of questions, and we usually, the ones we get from people who've registered more than like last week. I think Katie sent us the questions last Friday or Thursday, So anybody who signed up after that, we may not answer your question today. I did look at them. I may have answered one or two, but yeah, we have plenty to go from before. And the thing is, you can still email us if you have a question. A few of the questions were very directed towards a specific thing, and probably won't answer that because it's not something that's more relevant to our whole audience. But you can certainly email us if you still would like. If we don't answer it today and you want to know, or you can put it in the chat box and we'll try to answer it at the end. So what we'll do is we'll go through the slides here that are actually questions and answers. And then after that, we're going to pull up a document that Katie's been populating during this presentation of all the questions you're asking today. And we'll go through those. And I'll tell you now that we're going to take a look at them. If there may be a question that we can't answer today, and what I'll do then is just say, hey, would you email us? And so I know who you are, and we can get an answer to you if it's that specific. Yeah, we like to think we know a lot, but I can tell you now there's a lot of things that we just can't answer off the cuff. So protocol for flooded wells. So I already talked about flooded wells. I just showed you an example using our help center. And what I'll mention is that short video I talked about, and also at the bottom, there's additional resources. We actually helped NEHA develop their fact sheets. They're on natural disasters. So there's one on flooding, there's one on hurricanes, there's one on a couple other things, forest fires and wildfires. So we were involved with that. And it's a pretty good document. It's 6 pages, so it's a little more, and it talks about what to do to be ready, what to do when it happens, and what to do afterward. And so that's probably a good guide to go to. And if, as far as general, here's what you need to do before, during, and after a flood. And if you have a specific question related to that, or I know there's one about wildfires and I didn't answer it because, well, if you're on, the question was about they had charcoal in their water. That really has nothing to do with the wildfire itself or what they may have done to put out the wildfire. So yeah, anyway, sorry, I digress. But that fact sheet and the ones that NEHA has are pretty good information and much more detailed than what we can do on a webinar today. I have a radon mediation system for my well water, fronted by a 1-micron water filter, protects solenoid switches from dirt. So yeah, I change, oh, I left a word out. I change the filter about every 3 months or when it looks especially dirty. What is recommended, and is the filter dangerous? So the question was really, is the filter dangerous because it's collecting radon? And you know, the filter isn't there to remove radon. Radon's in solution in the water. The only ways to really remove it are aeration or a carbon filter, a carbon block filter, which you know, it's the pores in the carbon are actually because of the valence and stuff, it's attracted to it and holds it. So your filter isn't removing radon, it's removing all the particulates that might foul that radon mediation system. So really what it's doing is it's prolonging the effectiveness of that radon unit, and also making it less often that you might have to have it maintained. And I don't know what kind of, I know one of the things you'd said in this is that it's 20, you've done this, had this for 28 years, I think. So I don't know if you do any maintenance on it anymore or not, but if not, you probably want to talk to the manufacturer about that too. But if you don't, if you're not following the recommendations for the filter, just look it up. You can find by the company and the product code what they recommend. And this is where I say it also depends on how dirty your water is. If you have water that has a lot of particulates in it, then you may have to change it more often. In one of our other webinars, I show a filter that one of them is brand new and it's white, and the other one is just a month old and it's completely black, and that's with iron and manganese. This person has so much iron and manganese in their water that they couldn't wait 3 months. It just would break through, and they just have it staining all their porcelain and stuff anyway. And so you don't want to wait till it looks especially dirty. As soon as it starts to look dirty, unless it's, you know, and if it's more than that, then there are additional systems, and you know, I'd want to know what the particulates are. We had a case in Illinois where we went out and sampled, and their filter was filling up every week. And so I sent that to a lab in Nebraska, the actual solids, and it was all iron and manganese. And they just have that much of it. So, and even an advanced system they had wasn't helping as much as it needed to. And it's just really poor water quality, and there's not a great solution. But you know, you're trying to protect your radon mediation system because that is a risk. But yeah, that's hopefully that answers your question. But yeah, the one thing I do want to say is I imagine replacing that filter on your 1 micron filter unit is much less expensive than maintenance would be if, you know, you foul your solenoids and switches and have to have somebody come out. So it's probably money well spent. This is worded exactly how it was given to us. Ramifications to the environment of bad wells, areas of concern, impact of CAFO, confined animal facilities. Proximity, does it increase timeline for testing and maintenance? Well, for any source, whether that's an animal operation, industrial leakage, if you're near a factory, you know, application of pesticides, really what's going on depends on the geology and well construction of your well. How vulnerable your well is and your water is, and how likely it is that those things may get into your well. So like in my county, where I live in Champaign County, Illinois, most well owners are on a deeper sand and gravel aquifer. There's over 100 feet of clay till, which is glacial till, which is mostly silt and clay, which doesn't allow water through it very well on top of it. And so we don't see contamination of our wells, even if it's on top of one of these sources. It just doesn't happen. It can't get through that material in hundreds and hundreds of years, and it's broken down as it moves through the ground. So if it's a properly constructed well and you know there's no way water is going in around the outside of the casing, and you have an aquifer that's well protected, and you know that your water is coming from a specific depth. So like I said, in this case, it's sand and gravel, so it has a screen. It means the well's solid casing down to over 150 feet or so. So no water can get in the well until 150 feet. Then it's very unlikely that there would be any risks from any of those things. But in other areas where it may be karst, geology, or fractured bedrock at the surface, or sand and gravel at the surface where there's a lot of infiltration, then those areas are at risk of any kind of contaminant, whether it's a point source like a confined animal unit, or it's non-point source if it's from, you know, something else. You just really need to understand where the water is coming from, meaning where it's getting in your well, at what depth, and what's above it as far as geology, as well as how your well was constructed. So, and I said here, figures from PDC lessons, the private well class lessons, because this is some of the things that are in our lessons talking about those issues, and these are just examples. You know, because contaminants, if the soil's very clay and has very slow infiltration, then when you spill something, it's going to run off more than it's going to run in, versus a rapid infiltration environment where it's larger particles, sands typically, or there's fractured rock right at the surface, then more is going to run in instead of run off, and it's going to be more of a problem. And so understanding the soils and shallow geology is important. Also, different contaminants are different in different ways. I love this figure on the upper left or upper right, because we have a well that we monitor and just the water level, but it's in an area near a refinery where over, you know, the last 70 to 100 years, crude oil has been spilled, and now there's a film of crude oil that sits on top of the aquifer. It's less dense than water, so it sits on top, and you can't put a device down to measure the water level without getting crude oil on it. And so it's really, you know, it just depends on what constituent it is, where it's going to end up, how, you know, this shows the water table in this example, but there may be several aquifers. Water table doesn't necessarily mean that it is an aquifer. In this case, it is. But yeah, and it also depends on the groundwater flow direction, like it's showing on the bottom one. And this one's near and dear to me because I grew up in a time on a small farm where when you had something that you wanted to get rid of, like an old barn, you had your cousin or your uncle come over with a bulldozer and dig a really big hole, and you just pushed the whole thing in and buried it. No matter what was inside it, all those things, nails and all. So, and I know that happened when I was a kid on my farm. And so this situation very well could be an issue in a lot of rural areas. And there's no way to know if there's been anything buried. It's just, yeah, there's just so many potential sources that, yeah, might even not know about. I know even we had an industrial facility, you know, we house the state's well logs and all the well records, right? So, and we have for over 100 years. So we had a lawyer contact us about an industrial facility and asked if we knew where their dump site had been. None of the modern maps show it, nothing. We had a record for that facility because they have wells that they use that are high capacity. And in their files, we had a map from 1948 that had garbage dump labeled on it. And so we were able to provide that to this, for this case that was going on. And so, yeah, no one knew until then. Yeah, you never know what you're going to find. The best thing is to be protected. As far as chlorination, there's a number of different questions about coliform and chlorination and stuff. So I'm just going to give our main response here and what we recommend. And that's, you know, when should you chlorinate your well? You should only disinfect your well when it needs it, which is determined by sampling. You don't need to do it every year. You don't need to do it 3 times a year. And you need to follow these guidelines, or some that are very similar. This is from the Minnesota Department of Health. You can find it on our lesson 10 under those additional resources. It's really the best document for how to disinfect your well that we've come across. And we've looked at, I mean, literally 50 or more. And so it's great advice. It tells you how to mix a chlorine so you're not putting straight bleach. You know, chlorine's an oxidant, which means it'll pull out metals from bedrock. So if you have bedrock that's high in some metal that's not healthy, you pour straight bleach down there and it has a chance to mix in. You're going to be having very high values for some of the metals that are naturally occurring in that rock. And so it tells you how to mix it, how to make sure, plus it's an oxidant, so it's going to leach stuff off of your pipes, your fittings, all that stuff too, which, you know, are all harmful metals to drink. And so this guide is really useful. I will say that if you go to Minnesota's website today, this version is not there. At some point, they decided to streamline this. This is like 8 pages long, I think, or 10. And they thought that somebody in their infinite wisdom thought it was too long, so they made a much shorter version. It's not nearly as good. And I've even had Minnesota staff tell me that. And so we have a copy of the older one. That's what's available on our website, and that's the one we plan to continue to provide. You know, like I said, it's got diagrams. It tells you what to do and what not to do. Even turn your pump off, all these things. What to do if you have treatment devices, and, you know, find out from the manufacturer's information whether you should leave it in line while you do this, or whether you should bypass it or take it offline, all that sort of stuff. And then once you've, so the main things you do with shock chlorination are you mix it in the well first, so it's at a level where it needs to be between 200 and 300 parts per million, I think. And then you run it through all the lines in your home. And so you run every faucet, every toilet, every shower until you smell chlorine, then you turn it off. And typically you do that right before you go to bed, and you let it sit overnight. Now you have chlorinated water in all your pipes, because you don't know for sure where that coliform is coming from, or bacteria. It could be biofilms that are in the pipes in your home. It could be from the well itself. You really have no way of knowing, and it could be any of those things. It's not that biofilms are an odd thing. They're actually probably much more common than people realize. But the problem there then, as far as some of the things we want to mention, is that if a biofilm's developed over a long time inside of a pipe, it could be fairly thick, and it has layers. And so basically when you chlorinate, you're killing the top layer, but you're not getting to the stuff underneath. And so in those cases, you may decide you want to try shock chlorinating 2 or 3 times, Because once you chlorinate, shock chlorinate your well, then you should test and make sure that it comes back negative before you use the water. And so, and if you're worried about drinking chlorinated water, the procedure is the next morning, you run all the lines until you no longer smell chlorine, and you pump all that to waste. And so now you've, in theory, killed all the bacteria in your lines, and you're also not drinking that chlorinated water that may have brought with it metals and other things that aren't healthy. And so it's in and out. You don't have chlorine in your line after the fact, and then you can test it and see if it's safe. And if it still has bacteria, which may happen, it's because of one of these reasons. It could be that there's biofilms, and it takes several instances. It could be that you have a continuous source, like the diagram that we showed from the septic smart week thing. There it turns out that the septic field has basically the direction of flow from that is right to your well. It could be that there's a thin sand layer in the, like you have a shallow well and it runs right to your well, and that's where most of the water is coming from, and that runs right through your septic field. So that would be a continuous source. Or if you're right near a feedlot and you're always putting, you know, horse manure or cattle manure or whatever, all that's getting into the ground, and every time it rains, it's flushing some of that through, you're gonna get bacteria from all that. You basically have a continuous source, and the only way to not have bacteria is to disinfect all the time, and not shock chlorination, but adding like a chlorinator or a UV unit, ultraviolet light, to kill all the bacteria and other things that might be getting in your water. Or drill another well if that's the case, you know, in a different unit if it's possible. There's a number of options. The other thing is that chlorine is effective at pHs of 7, 7.5 and below. And because of the way the chemistry works out, it forms an ion above pH 8 that isn't as effective as a disinfectant. And so if your pH is high, then chlorine may not be effective at all in disinfecting and killing bacteria. And that's just the nature of the chemistry of chlorine. You know, there's we have a work group of a few experts who get together quarterly. We're going to start looking at what other guidance there might be here. One thing we've seen is some folks are starting to recommend using white vinegar along with the shock chlorination process, and it alone will, at least the water that's immediately in your well, will lower the pH. Not sure how sustainable that is as an option. Like I said, we want to look into it, and we haven't yet. But there has to be a solution, whether, you know, and that may be that you have to use UV and use continuous ultraviolet light as a treatment option. So, and there also could be other things in the water that react with chlorine, not necessarily bacterial, but chemical. And so it's somehow binding the chlorine before it can really kill anything. And what I'll tell you is, if when you do the shock chlorination, if you have to, if you can't get the water to smell like chlorine when you run it through your pipes, that's probably a real key thing to understand, that it's probably already gone from the water. And so you may have to retreat or try it again the next day or whatever. So yeah, so it's not a perfect science. And yeah, it's just the way it is. Are certain depths of wells safer than others? So I showed this diagram. This is also part of our private well class lessons, and this is from the state of Iowa. We've enhanced this figure. This isn't the original one, same with the others. But generally, you have little say in what your well depth's going to be, because you only have specific options. In this case, in Iowa, there's the upper part is all unconsolidated sand and gravel and clay and silt from glaciers, and then you hit bedrock. And the first bedrock unit there is limestone, then a shale, which is not a bedrock unit, or which is not a water-bearing unit, and then limestone again, which is, and then sandstone, which is. And so there's a deep well that goes down in the sandstone here that probably taps the limestone as well. And then there's a couple shallow wells that are those little bluer colored units that are sand and gravel. You find those typically, that's where when glaciers were melting, water was running through a channel, deposited sand and gravel, and those things were left over at the end. But they serve as water supplies. And those are typically along current river valleys, especially. You have a lot of sand, and so there's a lot of water available. But you may not have any of those choices. You know, we have areas where people have to put in a bored well, and they're getting water from the water table, which is still clay and silt and some sand, but it's saturated. And water seeps into the well really slowly. That's why you build a large diameter well that's 3 or 4 foot in diameter, because it's meant to be a storage unit and give you more room for water to seep in when you start pulling water out. You know, a typical bored well or a dug well, you use water in the morning, you use it in the evening, you're gone during the day. So during the day when you're gone, it fills back up. During the night after you're going to bed, it fills back up, but you're pumping a lot of that down. And in a really dry year, you may even have wells that go dry or can't sustain pumpage. Our well that I grew up on, a couple times I left the hose in our tank for our horses and walked away, and we might not have water for 2 or 3 days. And that's because we had a 14-foot hand dug well and it was dry. And so there is no best well depth. What I will say though is if you have choices, like, you know, there's sand and gravel and there's also bedrock, you can usually go by where all the other wells are, because unless like the upper sand and gravel has some real water quality issues, most of the wells are going to be in that. Just because if there's plenty of water and it's of sufficient water quality, there's no reason to put in a more expensive and deeper well. But it may be that there are issues, and then you may have options like these sandstones or limestones. And then you need to look at the water quality of those as well before you try to find out if there's information, because they could have natural occurring metals or like uranium in Massachusetts. All those things are a possible source. So there is no best well depth. It really depends on where your property is and what the geology and water quality is there. For a new well owner, I don't even know what questions to ask. Enlighten me. So that's what I'm trying to do. Hopefully I've done a decent job of that today. And can you suggest any helpful reading prior to class? Well, and class meaning this webinar. This is not the class, which is okay, but sign up for the private well class. It's literally the first step every well owner should take. If you're going to participate in our webinars, there's things I'll say here that are like, oh yeah, I read that in the thing or whatever. But once you go through the material, you have a much better understanding of your well, what type of well it is, what possible issues you might have. Hopefully you've done a little extra work and found out like where your well log is, or you have it already. Maybe there's some water quality data available online. You know, those sorts of things are where you need to start. And then that's when these become more valuable, because you can ask better questions. And, you know, I track every person who says something nice about us. I put that in a file, an email file. And so these are a few. Your site, classes, and seminars have been invaluable resources for us, and thankfully we found you before we started construction. These folks are currently building a house out in the country. And yeah, our state engineer's office was a bit taken back by our, as they quoted, higher knowledge. And after showing them where we gleaned all this information, they now recommend that on their site, which is great praise for us. But it's, you know, the more people that know about it, the better, because it is great basic information that helps most well owners. So it's something we should all be promoting. And it's all free, that's the thing. We were recently introduced to your work by a farmer we were advising. And after reading through your website, we can see why it became so highly recommended. So this is a professional that's working with farmers, probably extension, I don't remember. But it's, you know, we're not trying to necessarily toot our own horn, but at the same time, we know we have a really good product, and we probably don't do enough of that. So it really is a great resource that you should all share. Yeah, there's 2 more there. Yeah, like I said, if you haven't taken the class, sign up and go through the class. It's pretty simple. Each lesson's 6 to 10 pages. There's a lot of figures. It doesn't take that long. You get 1 a week, and for every person who does the evaluation, for one person that says, I wish these would have came a little quicker, somebody else says, these came too fast. And so we've left it at a week ever since we started, and it seems to work out pretty well. Prior to my community being built, it was farmland. Historically, the entire 100+ square mile area has been small agricultural. We tested high in PFAS in our well. Is it from water that has flowed from further away than 100 square miles, which is only a 10-mile square, or from application of farm chemicals? Well, First of all, the reason I said this, who's to blame, is you seem set on it being one or the other, and this is not an either or situation. There are PFAS chemicals in some farm chemicals in some pesticides, but there's really no way to say that it's one of those two. There's other sources. There's a lot of sources. In fact, I mentioned Jackie and Jennifer, who did the webinar on PFAS. They did a national study and looked at different areas. There's a lot of other potential sources, including your septic system. So what that testing shows is that for most private wells, it has to be a nearby source. The further away from a source, the less PFAS that was found. And that means airports, industrial sites, or a lot of wastewater plants now apply their solids because they're a great fertilizer on farmland. And so we have some farmers who have contracts with the local wastewater utility, and they're applying their solids there because it's a good secondary use. Well, those can be really high in PFAS, is what we've learned in the last 4 or 5 years or so. And so there's a lot in groundwater in those areas. They're more of a risk. But in rural areas where there's no known source, and a known source doesn't mean ag chemicals, one of the conclusions is it could very likely be your septic system. These things don't break down ever, and so eventually they make their way, and probably more PFAS get into your shallow water system, geologic system from your septic than anything else. And that doesn't mean that this is what's going on in your case, but in all honesty, if ag chemicals were the source, then in most farming areas where there's any kind of infiltration, which means that it's sandier soils at the surface, so anywhere they irrigate, you would see a lot of positive and high PFAS values, and that's just not what we see. Now, I will say, in researching this, because I wanted to make sure I had it right, it looks like there's a lot of small farm type crops, vegetables, some of those things, that those pesticides may be higher in PFAS. And so that's why I said here, more info is needed on small ag too, because I couldn't find a lot. I didn't spend a lot of time looking, but certainly there's certain crops, tomatoes and almonds and a few they mentioned, and some of the stuff I did read that tend to use those types of pesticides more. But corn was also mentioned as some of the corn pesticides use, and the PFAS is there to make it go on better, to hold it in the environment longer, some of those things. It's not the main component. PFAS is not it doesn't kill plants or bugs. It's there to, it's there to help with how it gets applied. But it's still in there for sure. So, So on to the questions where I ran over, darn, I apologize. I'm gonna go right to that though, if I can find it. Oh, there they are. There we go. Sorry. Katie, is that showing up?
Yep, it looks good.
Oh, well, we have one question. So for those of you still on, PFAS testing is not required that I know of anywhere. Even the new rule doesn't take effect till next year, I don't think, or in 2 years. And they're trying to roll some of that back, and so a lot of communities are testing for it, and a lot of states may have already implemented their own rule. And in those areas, community water supplies may be testing, but it is not required. And you're very lucky in Iowa that you have it used to be called the Grants to Counties program. I can't remember what it's called now, but we actually did a webinar, we did a podcast with the two folks from Iowa that run that program at the state level and work with the counties. And I highly recommend you listen to that. Just go to drinkingwaterpodcast.org, and if you scroll through the episodes, you'll find it. It was this last year. They also came to our conference in May and gave a presentation, which we recorded, so you can look at the 2025 Private Well Conference and find the talk about the Iowa program. But it's awesome. Since the 80s, the legislature in Iowa has provided funding to the counties for private well testing, for abandoning wells, for cost sharing, some of the other things that working with their drillers for folks who have water quality issues. There's a number of things that program provides funding for. And so I would talk to your county health department, and because of that program, a lot of the counties in Iowa, health departments, I mean, have much more wherewithal related to private well issues than in a lot of states where there are no programs. And it's hit or miss whether a county has someone who knows much about private wells or not. In some states, they require inspecting every well. In some counties, they do that too, but not everywhere. And so folks in your county should be able to help you. So with that, no other questions. Thanks everyone for attending, and have a great rest of your week.